Okay, my full name is Gary James Lombardi. I'm born September 19th, 1942, and I'm a Roman Catholic priest.
And can you tell me what your connection is with Charles Schulz?
Well, my connection with Charles Schulz is that we were friends, and we were golf partners and friends for I forget how many years, but for many years.
I'd like to start off by asking you a bit about your background. Can you tell me where you grew up and where you went to high school?
Yes, I was born I'm from Southern California, and I was born in Van Nuys, California, but raised in a little town called Newhall, which is just about 10 miles north of the San Fernando Valley. It is now called Valencia or Santa Clarita. You can take your pick, and there are different names for it. And I went into the seminary I did high school when I went into the seminary, studying for the priesthood for the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. And in those days, they had a high school seminary in San Fernando with the San Fernando Mission. And I did, 4 years of high school, and then 4 years of college studies with a major in philosophy and a minor in Spanish. And that was at both the Queen of Angels Seminary, then also to St. John's Seminary in Camarillo, California. And then there was 4 years of postgraduate theological work at St. John's. And I was ordained, and then I came up here in 1968, in October of 68, and I served and was ordained to the priesthood on March 9th, 1969 in St. John's Church in Healdsburg. And I've served in our diocese ever since. I was about 5.5 years at St. John's, and then I came here to St. Vincent's in Petaluma for 3.5 years as an associate, and then I went to St. Eugene's Parish in Santa Rosa for 3.5 years, and then to Sacred Heart Parish in Eureka for 3.5 years, and then I went to Ukiah, California, St. Mary's Church for 9.5 years. It was during that time that I met Sparky. And then I was transferred down here again in November of 1994, and I've been pastor here ever since.
And can you talk a little bit about the first time you met Charles Schulz and how you met him?
Yeah, I was playing golf with a good friend of mine, Bob Morato. We would play golf, every week. My day off was Thursday. And so we would gather for golf, and we had another friend named Larry James who worked with Bob, and Larry and his brother Dean were good friends of Charles Schulz. I had seen Sparky at various gatherings, different golf tournaments and things. He would be there. I didn't know him. I'd just seen him once in a great while, and he was well known in the area. I remember we played golf one day in Bodega Bay, and I guess Bob and Larry were talking about the following Thursday, and Larry said, because there was just the three of us, and Larry said, I'll bring a fourth. And I went back to Ukiah for the parish, and I came down that Thursday morning. We went to Oakmont, and Bob met me in the parking lot, and he said, do you know who we're playing golf with today? I said, no. And he said, well, we're playing golf with Charles Schulz. I said, oh, that's nice. He said, that's nice? I said, yeah, that's nice. He says, do you realize how many people in the world would love to play golf with Charles Schulz? I said, no. I said, but it's nice that we can. So we did, and I didn't know what to call him, Mr. Schulz or Charles. I never thought of calling him Charlie, and I've discovered, of course, that anybody who would call him Charlie doesn't know him. So I must have called him Charles. Don't know. All I know is that we played golf that day, and Bob and I teamed up against Sparky and Larry, and we had a great match. In fact, it was just a great match. It was a very tight match. I remember he sunk a long putt, and I sunk a long putt to win a hole. We had a great time though, and I think I think Bob and we might have won that match. If we did, it's the last time we ever did, I think. But anyway, we went into the bar, and where I would normally have had a beer or something, but we had Cokes instead because he doesn't drink, and he was very pleasant, and it was a very easy round, and I remember him saying, "Well, this was a lot of fun. Can we do this again next week?" And that was the beginning of, I don't know, Jeannie might know, 10 or 12 years, I forget how many years. We played almost every week, every Thursday, and our tea time was always 11:52, most of the time at Oakmont. So that's how the friendship started. And Sparky was very fascinated by me as a Roman Catholic priest, because he was a religious man, but a very thoughtful religious man. Not, I don't know how to say it. It was not shallow at all. It was very deep, and he had, how would you say this? He had, really good reasons for whatever it was that he did, and so he began, very quickly. The next week or so, he started asking me, "Well, what are you thinking of for your sermon next Sunday?" I said, "Well, I don't know. I haven't really looked at the readings yet." And and then he began to ask me about that. And so that's kind of how it all started.
That's fantastic. Fantastic. And what were your first impressions of him? Was he very competitive? Was he?
Oh yes, Sparky was very competitive. He was very real. When I play golf, it's just absolute agony. Every bad shot is just agony, and I would get totally frustrated. And he knew that feeling completely. He experienced that himself. And there were times when I wanted to quit, and he would say, "Well, we'll see if you're here next week or not." And I'd start off, and I'd hit a very bad drive, and he says, "It just never changes, does it? It's always the same." And my friend Bob was always trying to boost me up. Sparky never tried to do that. He just realized that it was just awful, and because if you look at his strip, he was always he was a man who's very much in touch with I've always called it the mysterious or underside of life, and he knows that life is not always fair, and there are no easy answers, and he was very much in touch with that. I'd say he was Charlie Brown. That seems to me to be, that's the character is Sparky. So he was he was just aware of the futility of things, and that's why he knew the agony of what happens if you take golf too seriously and you don't do well, and it happens to a lot of people. Happens to me. But he'd laugh about it, But he'd also, I remember one time I was so depressed I decided I'm never going to play again. And Bob said, I said, I don't know that I'll be here next week. He said, "What?" I said, "Well, you can't quit now. I said, "Well, I just don't know. I can't keep going through this." He says, "Well, we're playing golf. And then we're with Sparky and Schulz. We're so lucky to be able to be with him." And I said, "I know, he's wonderful, but I just can't keep putting myself through this." And I drove home, and there was waiting for me. I drove back up to Ukiah. I think maybe the next day. I stayed overnight with a priest friend, and I got to Ukiah. And when I walked into the rectory, there were about 10 or 12 boxes of what is called the Anchor Bible. The Anchor Bible is probably maybe one of the most highly regarded commentaries on the Bible in the world, in English anyway. And it's contributed to by all kinds of scripture scholars, both Roman Catholic and Protestant. And it's like what libraries have, and it was from Sparky. And there was a little note saying, this is something for you. You do so much for other people. He says, so I'll see you next week unless you decide to quit. So, that's kind of a thing those are some of the, he was that kind of a person. But he was very interesting to talk to. And, he would ask questions, and Larry James was part of the foursome. And Larry is like a diamond in the rough. He's a character who, he became Roman Catholic, and but he knew all the Roman Catholic things. And one time he was talking about holy water. And I remember Sparky turned to me and he says, holy water, he says, what makes water holy? And I said, I hate when you ask questions like that, And so later on in the round, we came to the eighth hole. It was the eighth hole at the time at Oakmont, and there was, maybe it was I think the eighth hole. And there were two lakes. There are two lakes to the right, but in front of the tee. So you're teeing off over water. And of course, he's my opponent, as always. And just before I get ready to tee off, he says, oh, by the way, he says, you'll notice those two lakes in front of the tee box. That's just to kind of get you focused on the water, And he says, there's two things about those lakes. One is there's an awful lot more water underneath than there is on the top. And he says the other funny thing about those two lakes is that one has holy water in it and one doesn't. And then, of course, they'll start to laugh, but you couldn't, and no matter what you would say, it would always come back to haunt you later on. You'd always remember. And but he was a wonderful friend, really. And we, he had a lot of money, of course, but that was really secondary to him. He paid attention to it, but his life was not dominated by that at all. All he ever wanted to do was to write the funniest comic strip he could think of each day. And the money that came along with it was something he used as needed. But his life was not dominated by that at all. And actually, he taught me a lot about stewardship. I remember that I was going to do some. By that time, I had moved down to Petaluma, and I wanted to do some work on stewardship, because Roman Catholics don't think in terms of stewardship in many ways. Now they do, but they didn't then, and Protestants seem to have worked it out better. But I asked him about it, and he told me, what he thought stewardship was and how he defined it and everything else. So I learned a lot about it because it's what he practiced, and he was, as I say, he was a very generous man, but he was very, very careful about what he gave to, But I remember telling him one time, I'm just so glad that great wealth has fallen into your hands, because you know what to do with the money. And as I say, he was a very simple guy. I mean, one time he had gotten a call from, not Robin Williams, not the comedian, but, I forget his name now, but there was a TV show called The Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. And they called him. They wanted to do a story on him. And he said, well, I don't have a lifestyle. And he said, no, I'm not going to have you do a story on me. And I said, well, Sparky, can you imagine if they did do the show? I mean, they would follow you around for a week or so, and you get up in the morning, and you'd go to he had some like physical trainer kind of a thing. He'd do some exercises, and then he'd go to the office. And he always, he started every day with a blank. He had a blank desk. That's it, and just sit there. And he started to think about what he could write that day. That's how he started every day. I said you'd sit there, they'd follow you, and sit there, and you start to try to figure out what you're going to do. You go to the Warm Puppy for lunch and have a cheeseburger or whatever it was. And you do that every day except on Thursday, when you meet, myself and Larry and Bob at Oakmont at 11, for our 11:52 tea time. And we'd have a cheeseburger that Yoshi would make for us. Then we'd play around and have a couple of Cokes, and then you go home. The lifestyles of the rich and famous, I said they would have been somewhat disappointed. But that's how he lived his life. Very simple. And I mean, yeah.
Did he ever talk about working on the strip when you guys were playing?
I'm sorry?
Did he ever talk about his work, working on the strip, or anything related to just working on Peanuts?
Yes, no. He would talk about it. I say he told me that's how he worked. That he said, people always telling him about this and about that, and they give him accolades, and he says all I want to try to do is to write the funniest strip that I can think of that day. And as I say, he started his. At least he told me this. I mean, I was in his office when he was showing me around, and he had his just a empty thing, and then we just sit there and start to think about what it was that he could write. He tried to keep. He was I forget how many. He was a certain number of months ahead for the daily strip, and a certain number of months ahead for the Sunday strip. And really, that's what his full focus was. Now he had all those other side things, the marketing and all that, but the licensing, but that kind of came about secondarily. Wasn't his doing; somebody else's doing. But his focus was on writing the strip. That was his whole life. I mean, besides obviously his kids and his family and his friends, but he. I do remember when, and sometimes I've got a couple of strips here that he gave me, and he would say he'd give me a strip, or to Bob, and he'd say to Gary, who gives me all my good ideas. We've had a few, we'd start talking, and then I'd say something, and he'd kind of prick it up, and then you might see it in the strip. We went to Italy for 2 weeks. He went on he invited me and Larry, and for 2 weeks they were gonna do a kind of a exhibition of his work in Rome, and all these clothes designers, they'd dress all these Snoopies up, and so they were for 2 weeks, and I remember at the end of it, we're sitting in the airport in Rome, getting ready to fly back. It was early in the morning. And he said to me, he says, I think I have 1 or 2 ideas for a strip. I mean, 1 or 2 for after 2 weeks in Europe. And that was about, 1 or 2. So he drew a lot of his ideas from what people would say. But I'd say his passion, work-wise, was writing the strip, and that was the most important thing to him. And the fact I've got the up there the last strip, and it's just amazing to me that he died the morning that his last strip came out. And it was just phenomenal. I got a call at 2 or 3 in the morning from his son saying that he'd passed away. And it was amazing to me because I knew that was the morning of the last strip. So it was, in terms of how do you say it? I mean, his labor, his work, his passion. And when that ended, his life ended. It was interesting to me.
Did you feel when you guys, and maybe this spread to outside of playing golf, but did you ever feel that he was able to speak to you about these more, maybe not just necessarily religious conversations, but maybe philosophical conversations?
Yeah, we never really engaged in a lot of deep philosophical conversations. But yeah, we could talk. I mean, we could talk about anything. He called me when he got the news of his illness. You know, he said, "You better get your funeral homily ready, because I think that I've been given a bad diagnosis." And then when I saw him in the hospital and he'd had the stroke, I remember him saying, "I never thought I'd get a stroke," you know. But we did. We would, from time to time, converse about various things. I can't remember, no, specifically. But because in many ways, I mean, I think we both shared a similar approach. I mean, I'm a Roman Catholic priest. It's a very highly organized religion. He was Christian. And then later on, I think he said somewhere that he thought he might be a secular humanist. He was always thinking and trying to describe what he was. But the thing is, we're going to kick that ball. I mean, he's aware of the futility of life. There's no pat answer. So that's how, so we would have those kinds of conversations. I remember one time when he said, I remember him very clearly, we were talking about prayer, and he says, I pray, but I will never say a prayer, And I told him, I said, I thoroughly understand that. And I know what real prayer means, but then as a priest, you're asked to go give a invocation at some sort of gathering, and they just want you to kind of give a little prayer. Well, that's not prayer the way he understands prayer or I understand prayer. So that's what I mean by his depth of understanding.
Yeah. So he had called you said, when he got diagnosed?
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about that conversation?
Well, I remember, I can't remember, this is kind of hazy, but there was something going on, and he said, he had to go to the doctor for something or other, I forget. We were going to play golf, he wasn't feeling too well. I forget exactly what it was. And I didn't think too much about it, other than, I was hoping he was feeling better, that sort of thing. Now that I'm thinking about it, it seemed to me that there was something, and whether he couldn't play golf or wasn't sure. But I remember a Saturday morning getting a phone call from him saying, "You'd better get your funeral homily ready," because I forget what he told me, but he was very seriously ill. So, and I don't know that we talked a lot about it. If we did, I can't remember what we said. Because it really wasn't too long after that I think he had a stroke. I can't remember all the details about that.
Yeah.
But we did not get into a lot of conversation about that. And we, because I think we probably had talked about things around that before. Because, even we're always aware of, like I said, you're always aware that, there's no pat answers, things aren't always simple, and I'm very much aware of it myself. I'm a priest, but I'm also very aware that, it's quite possible that there's nothing, and that you can't explain suffering. You can't explain it. You can't say, well, this happened because, or God only asks, from the people he loves, and that's all, pious stuff that doesn't really answer the real mystery. And he was a man in touch with the mystery of life, So we had probably talked about that before, but I don't recall really spending a lot of time at that point. other than to say, I will, pray for you, and, I'll do what I can,
Okay. And did you guys always play against each other?
I don't think we were ever partners.
Really?
I think it was always Larry and Sparky against Bob and myself.
Wow.
And Bob and I almost always lost. It seems like we almost always lost. And he was happy. And you'd have to pay up. You'd lose $1.25 or $2.25. And Bob and Sparky would always bet quarters against each other on a shot, and he would enjoy it. You'd hit a putt that would go like 10 feet past it. He goes, "Nice putt."
What other conversations did you guys have as a group? Did you guys talk about music, art?
No, I think once in a while it would be about a lot of things. I mean, people knew people. I mean, we knew people in general, in common, and sometimes something would come up about someone. Yeah, I don't, I can't. I mean, there'd be stories he would tell of, friends and experiences, but it would just kind of banter, but not deep conversation, not heavy discussions about X, Y, or Z, but more about just kind of experiences that we've had or stories that we told, and he is happy to talk about little, stories on himself. I remember him one time telling a story about he and Jeannie went somewhere, and some guy was in Canada, some French Canadian, I don't know what it was exactly, but he was saying that some man who was quite enthralled with Jeannie, this is a person who was putting on whatever it was, and they were having a very fancy dinner, and Sparky didn't, he would eat something. And the man turning, Mr. Schulz, he says, "You are one of the most simple men I've ever met." And he just laughed his head off about it, because he wasn't, he didn't need all kinds of fancy stuff. But that was the kind of conversations that we would have. Not a lot of deep, heavy things.
Well, a lot of people make assumptions of who someone who's famous is. If there was something, a takeaway or a few sentences that you can just briefly describe who Sparky was.
I think he was Charlie Brown. I mean, that very much describes him, I think. And very thoughtful, he was a very bright man, a very honest man. He was very honest. If he was upset with something, you could tell. He wouldn't berate you or anything else, but he would just say no or whatever. I mean, he was honest. One of the tenderest moments, though, I remember was when there was a friend of his, Chuck Bartley, put together a little golf gathering of pros and friends to celebrate his birthday. We've been doing that ever since, in memory of him. And he and I drove out together to play golf. We were driving back, and he was saying, he says, Chuck Bartley wanted to do this. He says with me and my friends. And I tell him, but Chuck, I don't have any friends, And he says, but he says, I really made a wonderful friend in a place I never thought I would, in the Roman Catholic Church. He was talking about our friendship. So Sparky, as I say, he was a very honest kind of a guy, unassuming in some ways. But I don't know what to say to the world, but I think Charlie Brown probably pretty much describes a lot of who he is.